Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates and guests, it is my pleasure to address you on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and to share some insights towards today's discussions. As we're all fully aware, Pacific states face rising sea levels, king tides, flooding, drought, extreme weather events that threaten to overwhelm infrastructure, disrupt economies, displace populations, and threaten the very basics of life and impact upon sovereignty and people's cultures and traditions. For most Pacific countries, these factors are threat multipliers, exacerbating tensions related to pressures on land, rapid transition, and political instability. The climate crisis is also bringing to the forefront historical challenges existing in the Pacific, such as the nuclear legacy and the threat it has for future generations. The root causes of these threats we see here in the Pacific come from outside the region, and it is large carbon-emitting states who need to show international solidarity with Pacific states and those most vulnerable to climate change by increasingly working towards ambitious nationally determined contributions, because this situation is just unfair. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has stated it is clearly unfair for nations that contribute the least to climate change to be among those most affected. The impacts of the climate crisis are already being felt in the Pacific, and this means that whether climate action is ramped up and gathers pace, it will not be enough to save Pacific people from suffering the impacts on their human rights. Therefore, investment in adaptation and mitigation is vital if we are to limit the negative consequences of the climate emergency. As focal point for the Pacific, I have seen firsthand how the climate crisis is the greatest threat to peace, prosperity, and the enjoyment of human rights in the Pacific. This is particularly true for individuals and communities living in low-lying atoll nations, as the climate crisis directly threatens their sovereignty in terms of loss of territory. We are already seeing the small islands in the Pacific lost to the sea, and although there has been legal and principled discussions held in the Pacific regarding this existential threat, questions remain as to how best to protect the rights of people in these circumstances. The Pacific states have again been leading the way through international cooperation to grapple with this new phenomenon of climate change, as we recently saw that with the Pacific Islands Forum leaders' endorsement of a declaration on preserving maritime zones in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. OHCHR's mission in the Pacific has been a simple one: to mainstream human rights into the climate change discourse and to work towards ensuring the most vulnerable and marginalized in societies are not left behind. As we know, the climate crisis also has a heightened and disproportionate impact on groups in the Pacific communities. That includes women, children, youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, persons on the move, and the LGBTI community. What we are now seeing globally is people using international human rights mechanisms to advocate for their rights, and the Pacific is no exception. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child is currently considering a case brought by 16 children and adolescents, which includes children from the Pacific. They are challenging the disproportionate burden the climate crisis will place on their human rights. No matter the outcome of this case, the committee will draft a new general comment on children's rights and the environment with a specific focus on climate change. Similarly, the United Nations Human Rights Committee set an important precedent for future climate change-related asylum cases. It found that people who flee the impact of climate change and disasters should not be returned if they face climate change-induced conditions that violate the right to life. The finding came in response to a communication by a person from Kiribati. Moreover, a group of 8 Torres Strait Islanders submitted a petition against the Australian government to the Human Rights Committee, arguing that Australia is violating their fundamental human rights due to the government's failure to address climate change. Globally, OHCHR has joined 14 UN entities to call for the global recognition of a human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The right recognized by more than 150 states empowers individual and communities to press for and participate in action to ensure a safe and stable climate. Finally, I would like to highlight some of the actions and activities the Regional Office of the Pacific has completed in the past few years to ensure that vulnerable and marginalized groups are not left behind and are part of the solution to addressing the vulnerabilities caused by the climate crisis. The Regional Office held the first ever Human Rights and Climate Change Conference, which brought together individuals from states, civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, and business to work towards mainstreaming human rights discourse into climate discussions and heighten climate vulnerabilities. The Regional Office has conducted scoping missions throughout the Pacific so that we could truly understand how the climate crisis was affecting communities on the ground and how we could work with Pacific states to ensure the voice of the vulnerable and marginalized communities could be elevated at the international level. This includes providing the space for Pacific youth to speak at COP25 and other international fora. More recently, the regional office held a workshop in April and in June, focusing on Pacific Indigenous peoples and environmental human rights defenders in the context of the climate crisis. These workshops build the capacity of individuals and communities and empower them so they can utilize the international human rights mechanisms in order to protect Indigenous rights, traditions, and cultures. These discussions, I feel, are vital to the ongoing global negotiations which will take place at COP26 in Glasgow, as we need to make the case that not all loss and damage can be quantified in financial terms. The loss of culture is more than dollars and cents. We will also hold the second Pacific Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights on the 22nd and to the 24th of November, in which we will specifically focus on the need for business to do more in reaching net zero carbon emissions and take positive actions towards stronger climate action. Finally, I would like to thank you for this valuable opportunity to address you today and wish you constructive and fruitful discussions going forward. Please do know that OHCHR stands ready to support all initiatives and provide guidance as and when it is required. I thank you very much for your time.